but his whole conduct of the campaign. The Axis defense lines at El Alamein consisted of extensive minefields, strewn with barbed wire, in such a way as to funnel attacking forces into predetermined lines of fire. The fixed defences varied between 2 and 5 miles in depth and incorporated pillboxes, concealed firing points and forward command posts. As the front wound its way southwards, it became weaker, and it was here that the main British attack was expected. To counter any breakthrough in this sector, Rommel had 4 armoured divisions, 2 German and 2 Italian, but all were gravely deficient in battle-worthy tanks and in men, and there was insufficient fuel for a battle of manoeuvre. The available armour was therefore widely spread and would be fed piecemeal into the battle to plug breaches in the line as and when they occurred. At the end of September, Rommel returned to Germany for medical treatment and to press the High Command for greater efforts to supply his army. But the tide of battle in the Mediterranean was remorselessly turning against the Axis. In September, British air and naval forces based on Malta had sunk 1/3 of all Italian merchantmen bound for Libya. In October, the figure would be closer to a half. Of the tonnage actually landed, a large part would be consumed by garrison and rear echelon units. More would be lost to Allied airstrikes. As the inevitable battle approached, the defenders could do little but stockpile frantically the few supplies that actually reached the front. In May 1940, General Bernard Montgomery was serving as a divisional commander with the British Expeditionary Force in Belgium. When the Belgian army unexpectedly capitulated on May the 28th, Montgomery's 3rd Division sealed the breach and made possible the retreat to Dunkirk. Recognition of his skill and determination was to ensure his promotion to Corps Commander, and after his return to England, he was charged with the defence of the Kent coast. To prepare for the threatened German invasion, Montgomery introduced a number of measures, such as hard training regimes and reduced leave for officers. Although initially unpopular, these measures helped to improve morale and brought the Corps to peak fighting condition. Montgomery arrived in Egypt on August the 12th, 1942. Though stabilised, 8th Army's front at El Alamein was by no means secure, and his first task was to strengthen the defensive posture of the army and reinvigorate the troops. Montgomery brought to Egypt a reputation as a hard taskmaster. He was outspokenly critical of his predecessors, intolerant of their failings, and deaf to their advice. But he understood more clearly than they did the nature of the difficulties 8th Army faced and the pressing need for reorganising and retraining before any major offensive could be launched. Within weeks of his arrival in Africa, Erwin Rommel was already building the reputation that would eventually establish him as one of the greatest battlefield commanders of World War II. Although trained as an infantry officer, he had quickly mastered the new science of armoured warfare, achieving distinction as a panzer commander in France, before leading the Africa Corps in a spectacular blitzkrieg through Libya. His energy, imagination, and tactical boldness, which had so thoroughly bewildered 8th Army, won him international respect. Even Churchill was forced to admit that successive 8th Army commanders had simply been outwitted and outmaneuvered, and 8th Army veterans had come to see Rommel as almost invincible. In 1942, after the capture of Tobruk, Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal, the youngest in the German army, and the culmination of a meteoric career. But recognition of his achievements was not accompanied by adequate reinforcements and an increased rate of supply, and without these, his operational freedom was severely constrained. At Alamein, he faced a cruel dilemma. He could neither advance nor safely retreat. Only by defeating 8th Army in the coming defensive battle could he continue to hold the line, while pinning his hopes on Hitler's vaunted offensive in the Caucasus. As a career staff officer in the pre-war American Army, Eisenhower's organizational talents quickly brought him to the attention of General George Marshall, the Army's Chief of Staff and Roosevelt's principal advisor and strategist. In Washington, Eisenhower served as Marshall's subordinate, in charge of operational planning, and in 1942 he was sent to England to coordinate the American build-up for an eventual cross-channel attack. When the decision was taken to mount Operation Torch with a proportion of these forces, Eisenhower was the natural choice as Commander-in-Chief. Although inexperienced as a battlefield commander, his undoubted talents for diplomacy and delegation were regarded as essential attributes for the first major joint operation between British and American forces. The Allied forces for the coming Battle of North Africa consisted of two separate components: the Expeditionary Force, destined for assault landings in Morocco and Algeria, and the 8th Army, facing Rommel in Egypt. While 8th Army's task was clearly defined, the invasion force faced a number of uncertainties. The operation itself had no precedent in modern military history, and no one could confidently predict how the French would react. A hostile reception could have catastrophic consequences. There was a shortage of assault and landing craft, and logistics planning for beachhead supply was seriously deficient. Moreover, the operation had been hastily mounted, and insufficient time had been available to train the assault troops properly in amphibious landings. Much would depend on the attitude of the French, and the success or failure of Montgomery's offensive in Egypt. By the end of August, Montgomery had largely completed his primary task of bolstering the Alamein defenses, and a last despairing effort by the Axis forces had been effectively stonewalled. Throughout September and October, all efforts were directed at rebuilding 8th Army's strength and preparing it for the coming offensive. Planning and preparations emphasized the cooperation of all arms, the tactical role of each company and unit, and the expectations placed on individual officers and men. Comprehensive training programs were established